the cold hospital tiles pressed against my cheek, and I could taste copper in my mouth, blood mixing with the antiseptic smell that hospitals always have. My surgical incision screamed in protest as I tried to push myself up, nurses' shoes squeaking on the floor as they rushed toward me. 3 days. I'd been out of surgery for just 3 days when my stepfather decided I was faking being weak. I'm Rihanna Hester, 29 years old, and until that moment on the hospital floor, I thought I knew what rock bottom looked like. Turns out, I was wrong. The whole thing started when Gary, my stepfather of 3 years, stormed into my hospital room that morning. I'd just had emergency appendectomy surgery. You know, the kind where they tell you afterwards that you were about 2 hours away from things getting really serious. The surgeon said I was lucky they caught it when they did. Lucky. That word would come back to haunt me in ways I never expected. Gary had been complaining about the hospital bills before I even woke up from anesthesia. My mom sat quietly in the corner, the way she always did when Gary got going about money. She developed this skill of becoming almost invisible, shrinking into herself whenever his voice rose above normal conversation level. 3 years of practice had made her an expert at disappearing while still being in the room. That morning, he'd worked himself into one of his special rages, the kind where his face turned this interesting shade of purple that reminded me of those beets nobody actually likes, but everyone pretends to eat because they're healthy. He kept going on about how I needed to start earning my keep, how his hard-earned money wasn't going to support a freeloader. Mind you, I'd been working 2 jobs before my appendix decided to throw its dramatic tantrum, and I'd been paying rent to live in my childhood home ever since Gary moved in and decided he was the king of the castle. When I told him I couldn't work yet, doctor's orders were at least 2 weeks of recovery, that's when it happened. The slap came so hard and fast that I didn't even see it coming. One moment I was propped up in the hospital bed, the next I was on the floor, my IV stand crashing down with me, the machine it was connected to screaming its electronic protest. The metallic taste filled my mouth as my hands shook, not from fear, but from the shock of it all. Gary stood over me. His bowling league championship ring, the one he never stopped talking about winning in 2019, had caught my lip when he hit me. He was yelling something about how I needed to stop pretending, stop being dramatic, stop costing him money. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was creating quite the dramatic scene himself, especially when 2 nurses, a security guard, and eventually 3 police officers rushed in. You should have seen Gary's face when those officers walked in. It went from purple rage to white shock faster than his Corvette that he claimed could do 0 to 60 in 4.2 seconds, though we all knew he'd never actually tested it because he was too cheap to waste the gas. He immediately started trying to explain how this was all a misunderstanding, how he was just trying to give me some tough love, how kids these days, and yes, he called me a kid even though I was pushing 30, needed discipline. Officer Martinez, a woman who looked like she'd seen enough domestic violence cases to write a book about them, wasn't buying what Gary was selling. She took one look at me on the floor, blood on my hospital gown, nurses frantically checking my incision to make sure it hadn't reopened, and her jaw set in that way that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. And for once, it wasn't going to be me. My mom finally found her voice, but only to defend Gary, explaining how stressed he'd been with all the medical bills. The words came out of her mouth, but her eyes told a different story. There was something there, fear maybe, or just complete exhaustion from 3 years of walking on eggshells. She'd aged a decade since marrying Gary, and not in that graceful way some people do. This was the kind of aging that comes from constant worry and never knowing what mood would walk through the door each evening. Mrs. Chen, my elderly roommate who was recovering from hip surgery, pressed her call button repeatedly, demanding to give a witness statement. At 83, she had 0 patience for what she called men who think their fists make them important. She'd survived the Cultural Revolution in China, she told the officers, and she wasn't about to stay quiet while some bowling league reject terrorized a young woman. Gary particularly didn't like being called a bowling league reject. That league was basically his entire social life and identity outside of making our lives miserable. The police made Gary leave the hospital, but they couldn't make him leave our lives. Not yet, anyway. He was back home before I was even discharged, acting like nothing had happened. Mom picked me up alone, making excuses about how Gary had to work, but we both knew he was probably at home, polishing that stupid Corvette and telling himself he was the victim in all this. Let me back up and explain how we got here, because nobody starts out living with someone who thinks it's acceptable to slap you around in a hospital. Gary had entered our lives like most predators do, dressed up as salvation. Before I continue, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Thank you. 3 years ago, Mom was drowning in debt from my late father's medical bills. Dad had fought cancer for 2 years before it won, and even with insurance, the bills were astronomical. I was working retail and freelance graphic design, contributing what I could, but it felt like trying to bail out the Titanic with a coffee cup. Then Gary appeared at Mom's book club of all places. He was someone's plus one, claimed to be a successful businessman who'd just moved to town for the small-town charm. He drove that Corvette, wore expensive-looking clothes that I later learned were all knockoffs from outlet malls, and seemed to have solutions to all our problems. The courtship was whirlwind, 6 months from meeting to marriage. He promised to take care of everything, to be the man of the house we needed. Red flags? Oh, there were more red flags than a Chinese parade, but when you're desperate, you become colorblind to red. He moved in immediately after the wedding, and that's when the real Gary started showing up. First, it was little things. He needed to be added to Mom's bank accounts to help manage the finances. Then he convinced her to put him on the house deed. For tax purposes, he said. My disability payments from a car accident I'd had 5 years ago, those needed to go into the household account he controlled for budgeting purposes. I was working 2 jobs despite my chronic pain, but somehow we were always broke, always behind, always needing to tighten our belts, while Gary's Corvette never missed an oil change. I started noticing things going missing. Not valuable things. Gary was smarter than that. But paperwork would disappear. Medical bills would vanish before I could review them. Insurance documents would mysteriously get lost in the mail. When I'd ask about them, Gary would pat me on the head like I was a confused child and tell me he was handling everything, that I shouldn't worry my pretty little head about it. The condescension dripped off his words like syrup off a pancake, sickly sweet and just as fake. Mrs. Chen from next door, not the same Mrs. Chen from the hospital. This one was Vietnamese and made the best spring rolls in the county. She tried to warn us. She'd seen Gary screaming at Mom in the backyard, seen him punch the wall so hard he left a hole that he made me patch up and paint over. But she was scared too. Gary had a way of letting people know he knew things about them. Where they worked, where their kids went to school, what time they walked their dogs. Nothing explicitly threatening, just enough to make everyone uncomfortable. The pattern became clearer after my surgery. While I was lying in that hospital bed, I had time to think, to piece things together. Gary's rage about money wasn't random. It was calculated. Every time I got close to figuring out our finances, there'd be a crisis. Every time Mom started asking questions, she'd suddenly get sick with mysterious stomach problems that kept her bedridden and dependent. Every time I saved enough money to potentially move out, there'd be an emergency that drained my savings. The nurse who discharged me, Rebecca, slipped something into my discharge paperwork when Gary wasn't looking. It was a small card for a domestic violence hotline, hidden between instructions for wound care and prescription information. She didn't say anything, just squeezed my hand and gave me a look that said she'd seen this before too many times. The card had a website, and late at night when Gary was at his bowling league and Mom was asleep, I started reading. The patterns described there were like reading my own diary if I'd been honest enough to keep one. 2 weeks into my recovery, Gary made what would turn out to be his biggest mistake. He went to a bowling tournament in Atlantic City, a 3-day event that he'd been talking about for months. He'd even taken money from Mom's emergency fund to cover his entry fees and hotel, claiming he'd win it all back and more. Mom was having one of her bad days, curled up in bed with another mysterious illness, so I had the run of the house. I'd always wondered why Gary's home office was locked. He claimed it was for his important business documents, but for someone who was supposedly such a successful businessman, he sure spent a lot of time at home watching TV and yelling at cable news. Maybe it was the pain medication making me bolder, or maybe I'd just finally had enough, but I decided to pick that lock. YouTube University taught me everything I needed to know, and it turns out those fancy locks Gary installed were actually pretty cheap, just like everything else about him that seemed impressive at first glance. What I found in that office changed everything, and I mean everything. First, there were the marriage certificates, plural. Gary had been married 4 times before Mom, not the twice he'd mentioned. Each marriage had lasted between 2 and 4 years. Each had ended with restraining orders. I found the actual documents: Barbara from Ohio, Darlene from Pennsylvania, Susan from New Jersey, and Margaret from Delaware. There was a pattern to the locations too, always moving at least one state away after each divorce, probably to avoid anyone comparing notes. But that wasn't even the worst part. I found paperwork showing Gary had been collecting disability benefits in my name, using my Social Security number. He'd been filing claims I knew nothing about, pocketing the additional money while telling me my benefits had been reduced. There were credit cards in my name I'd never applied for, loans I'd never taken out, my credit score, which I'd been carefully rebuilding after some stupid decisions in my early 20s, was destroyed. And then I found the life insurance policies, 3 of them on Mom, all taken out in the last year, all with Gary as the sole beneficiary. The total payout if something happened to Mom? $2 million. For a woman who'd been healthy as a horse before Gary came along, she'd sure been sick a lot lately. Those vitamins Gary insisted she take every day, the special ones he ordered online because the store-bought ones weren't good enough, I photographed every bottle, every label. If you're still with me at this point in my story, I want you to know how much your support means. Please take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. The real jackpot was finding Gary's laptop, logged in and wide open. His email was a treasure trove of evidence. Conversations with other women on dating sites where he was still active, still trolling for new victims. His profile claimed he was a widower. Mom wasn't dead yet, but apparently Gary was planning ahead. He described himself as a successful entrepreneur with no kids, looking for a traditional woman who knows how to appreciate a real man. I threw up a little in my mouth reading that, and not just from the post-surgery nausea. There were emails to a lawyer about selling our house. Mom's house, the one Dad had paid off with his life insurance, so we'd always have a home. Gary was asking about power of attorney, about what would happen if Mom became mentally incompetent. There were searches in his browser history about undetectable poisons, about inducing heart attacks, about making deaths look natural. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone steady to photograph everything. I knew I couldn't do this alone. Gary had isolated us pretty effectively. Mom's friends rarely came around anymore. Family members had been pushed away by Gary's rude behavior at gatherings. But I had those names now, those ex-wives, and in 2024, everyone leaves digital footprints. I found Darlene first on Facebook. Her profile was locked down tight, but her profile picture showed her smiling, holding a sign that said, "Survived and Thriving." I sent her a message with just Gary's name and a photo of him. Within an hour, she'd responded with 3 words that told me everything. He got another. Our first phone call lasted 3 hours. Darlene's story was eerily familiar. The whirlwind romance, the financial control, the mysterious illnesses, the isolation. She'd gotten out when she caught him putting something in her coffee. She couldn't prove it was poison, but she knew. The divorce had been brutal. Gary had tried to claim she was crazy, but she'd had enough documentation to get a restraining order and keep her house, barely. Darlene had stayed in touch with Barbara and Margaret. Susan had passed away, officially a heart attack, but Darlene had her doubts. Within a week, we had a group chat going, sharing evidence, comparing timelines. The patterns were undeniable. Gary even used the same lines on all of us, the same tactics, the same escalation timeline. We started calling ourselves the Gary Survivors Club, which sounds funnier than it felt at the time. Margaret, who was a paralegal, started helping me understand what kind of evidence would hold up in court. Barbara, who'd become an advocate for domestic violence survivors, knew all the resources, all the right people to call. Darlene, who'd kept everything from her marriage to Gary, every receipt, every email, every text, had evidence that showed this was a pattern going back 15 years. Meanwhile, I had to keep playing the part at home. I had to pretend to still be weak from surgery, had to let Gary believe he was in complete control. It was the hardest acting job of my life, especially when he'd make comments about how Mom was getting sicker, how maybe we should start thinking about assisted living facilities, how he'd take care of everything when she was gone. The way he said when, not if, made my skin crawl. Mrs. Chen next door had noticed Mom's decline too. Her daughter, Amy, was a pharmacist, and when I showed her pictures of Mom's vitamins, her face went pale. She couldn't legally tell me what she thought they were without seeing the actual bottles, but she did say that several of the supplements Gary was giving Mom could cause exactly the symptoms Mom was experiencing, and that taking them long-term could cause organ failure. We needed more proof, and we needed it fast. Mom was getting weaker every day, and Gary was getting bolder. He'd started talking about a cruise he wanted to take with Mom, just the two of them, somewhere international where, as he put it, anything could happen. The way he said it made everyone in our survivor group chat agree. We had to act before that cruise. I started recording everything. Every conversation, every meal where Gary insisted on preparing Mom's food himself, every time he gave her those vitamins. I bought tiny cameras online, the kind that looked like phone chargers or smoke detectors. I hid them everywhere, the kitchen, the living room, Gary's office, even one in their bedroom disguised as a digital clock. What I captured would have been funny if it wasn't so terrifying. Gary, when he thought he was alone, would practice conversations. He'd stand in front of the mirror rehearsing what he'd say to police when Mom died. He'd practice crying, actually practicing fake tears like some kind of community theater reject. He'd count money that didn't exist yet, making plans for after his tragic loss. He even practiced his dating profile updates for after an appropriate mourning period, which, according to his timeline, would be about 3 weeks. The bowling league provided an unexpected break. Gary had been borrowing money from his teammates for a sure-thing business investment. He'd convinced 6 guys to give him their retirement savings, promising to triple their money in 6 months. The paperwork he showed them was completely fake. I know because I found the templates on his computer right next to tutorials on how to forge financial documents and best states for bigamy laws. Not exactly subtle, our Gary. 3 months after the hospital incident, Gary made his move. He came home from bowling league one Tuesday night with papers, legal documents that would give him power of attorney over Mom's medical and financial decisions. He claimed it was just a formality, something the lawyer recommended since Mom had been so sick lately. The timing wasn't coincidental. Mom had been particularly ill that week after Gary increased her vitamin doses, claiming flu season was coming and she needed extra protection. I was sitting at the kitchen table, still playing the part of the weak, recovering stepdaughter. Gary pushed the papers toward me, along with a pen that probably cost more than he'd ever spent on Mom's birthday presents combined. He wanted me to witness Mom's signature, said it would be better if family verified she was of sound mind when she signed. The irony of him caring about appearances of legitimacy while slowly poisoning my mother wasn't lost on me. Mom's hand shook as she reached for the pen. She looked at me with these hollow eyes, like she knew something was wrong, but couldn't quite figure out what. The vitamins Gary gave her, we'd figured out they included high doses of supplements that could cause confusion and memory problems when combined. Perfect for making someone appear mentally incompetent. I wanted to scream, to flip the table, to take that expensive pen and shove it somewhere Gary would need surgery to retrieve it. Instead, I did something better. I played along. "Gary," I said, putting on my best confused daughter voice, "shouldn't we have the lawyer here for something this important? I mean, just to make sure everything's legal and proper? You're always so careful about these things." His face did this interesting twitch, annoyance mixed with trying to appear reasonable. He couldn't argue without seeming suspicious, so he agreed to set up a proper signing for the next week. That gave us 7 days. 7 days to save Mom's life and put Gary where he belonged. The ex-wives group chat was buzzing with activity. Darlene had found something incredible. Gary had done this exact same power of attorney move with Margaret, right before she'd had her accident that left her hospitalized for weeks. The accident that made Gary her medical decision maker, right up until Margaret's sister flew in from Seattle and raised hell with the hospital administration. Barbara remembered something similar, though in her case, it had been about property transfer. We were mapping out Gary's playbook, and it was like reading a serial killer's handbook, except instead of murder, it was slow-motion financial and emotional assassination. I need to tell you about the bowling league discovery that changed everything. Remember those teammates Gary had scammed? Well, one of them, Big Eddie, and yes, that was really his name, all 300 pounds of him, had a nephew who worked in IT security. This nephew, Tyler, was one of those guys who could probably hack into the Pentagon, but chose to use his powers for good mostly. When Big Eddie found out his retirement money was gone, really gone, not invested in some magical startup, Tyler got involved. Tyler did some digging and found that Gary had been running the same scam in every state he'd lived in. We're talking about millions of dollars over 15 years, dozens of victims. But here's where it gets interesting. Gary wasn't smart enough to hide his digital trail. He used the same passwords for everything. Gary bowls 300 because of course he did. The same email variations, the same fake business names. Tyler documented everything, created a file that would make the FBI weep with joy at how easy their job was about to become. Meanwhile, at home, things were escalating. Gary announced he'd booked that cruise. 2 weeks in the Caribbean, just him and Mom leaving in 10 days. He'd already arranged for me to stay with an aunt I hadn't spoken to in years, claiming I needed family support while they were gone. The aunt, when I called her, had no idea what I was talking about. Gary had made the whole thing up, probably planning to claim I'd run away or something worse while they were gone. The cameras I'd hidden were capturing gold. Gary on the phone with someone, discussing how the situation would be resolved soon and how the insurance payout would make everything worthwhile. Gary grinding up pills and mixing them into Mom's protein shakes, the ones he insisted she drink for strength. Gary practicing his grieving widower act got more elaborate. He'd even bought a black suit, which he tried on while practicing his eulogy for Mom. The man was rehearsing her funeral while she was still alive, sleeping in the next room. If it wasn't so horrifying, it would have been absurdly comedic, like a villain in a bad Lifetime movie. The night before Gary's planned power of attorney signing, we made our move. It had to be coordinated perfectly. The FBI for the interstate fraud, Adult Protective Services for Mom, the local police for the assault and attempted murder, and even the IRS, because guess who hadn't been paying taxes on all that stolen money? The bowling league provided the perfect opportunity. Thursday night was championship playoffs, and Gary wouldn't miss it for anything. He'd been practicing his hook release for weeks, boring anyone who'd listen with details about pin carry and oil patterns. He left the house at 6:30, kissing Mom on the forehead in a gesture that would have seemed sweet if I hadn't seen him put something in her afternoon tea an hour earlier. At 7 o'clock, our house turned into something from a crime procedural. FBI agents, local police, social workers, and paramedics all arrived simultaneously. Mom was confused but cooperative as they took her to the hospital for evaluation and treatment. The vitamins were seized for testing. The computers, the documents, everything in Gary's office was boxed up as evidence. Mrs. Chen from next door stood on her lawn, openly videoing everything on her phone while providing commentary in Vietnamese to what I assume was every relative she had back in Saigon. At the bowling alley, a different scene was unfolding. The FBI agents waited until Gary was mid-frame. He'd just thrown what would have been a strike, his form perfect. That stupid championship ring glinting under the cosmic bowling lights. They let him finish the frame. Law enforcement can be petty too, and I appreciated it, before approaching. The entire league got to watch as Gary was read his rights, handcuffed, and walked out past the shoes rental counter. Big Eddie started a slow clap that turned into full applause by the time they got Gary to the door. But Gary's night wasn't over. Back at the house, they'd found enough evidence to add attempted murder to the charges. The vitamins tested positive for several substances that, when combined, could cause organ failure over time. The life insurance policies, the forged documents, the stolen disability benefits, it was a prosecutor's dream case. Gary's laptop had been seized too, with all his research on untraceable poisons and making accidents happen. For someone who thought he was so clever, Gary sure didn't understand that clearing browser history doesn't actually delete anything. Tyler, Big Eddie's nephew, had created a website, GaryScamAlert.com. Within hours of Gary's arrest, it went live with photos, documentation, and victim testimonials. The bowling league teammates weren't just angry about their money. They were furious about being made fools of. These were proud men who'd worked their whole lives, saved carefully, and Gary had played them like a fiddle. The website crashed 3 times that first night from all the traffic. Gary's arrest made the 11 o'clock news. The headline read, "Local man arrested in multi-state fraud and attempted murder scheme," which really didn't capture the full pathetic nature of his crimes. By morning, it had gone viral on social media. Someone at the bowling alley had filmed the arrest, and the video of Gary trying to explain to the FBI agents that this was all a misunderstanding while wearing those ridiculous bowling shoes became an instant meme. His workplace, oh yes, Gary actually did have a job, selling used cars at a dealership that advertised heavily during daytime TV, fired him via text message while he was still in custody. His boss later told reporters that Gary had been their worst salesperson anyway, spending most of his time trying to run side schemes with customers' trade-ins. The dealership actually saw an increase in sales after firing Gary, with customers specifically saying they'd stayed away because of him. The dating sites were brutal. The Gary Survivors Club had made sure his profiles were updated with his mugshot and a helpful note about his arrest. Women who'd been talking to him started sharing their conversations online. One woman posted that he'd asked her for a loan on their second date to help with his sick mother's medical bills. His sick mother had been dead for 15 years. But the best part, the absolute chef's kiss of karma, was when Gary's Corvette got repossessed. Turns out he'd been months behind on payments, juggling credit cards to make minimum payments while telling everyone he owned it outright. The repo man showed up during the news interview. Gary's court-appointed lawyer was trying to give on our front lawn. The look on the lawyer's face as the Corvette was loaded onto the flatbed in the background while he tried to claim his client was innocent was priceless. The news anchor actually laughed on air. Mom's recovery was remarkable once she was off Gary's vitamins. Within a week, her color returned, her confusion lifted, and she was able to give a full statement to police. The doctors said another month on those supplements could have caused irreversible damage. She cried when she realized what Gary had been doing, but they weren't just tears of sadness. There was relief there, too. Relief that she wasn't going crazy, that her illness had been real but manufactured. The other victims started coming forward. Women from Delaware, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania. They all had stories. The FBI created a dedicated tip line that received over 200 calls in the first week. Gary's pattern was so consistent it was almost boring. Find vulnerable women, marry them, or move in, take control of finances, slowly poison them while setting up life insurance, then cash out. The only reason more women weren't dead was that Gary usually got impatient and sloppy, leading to divorces instead of funerals. The bowling league formally banned Gary for life, which might seem minor compared to the federal charges, but for Gary, it was devastating. His lawyer actually had to prevent him from calling the league president from jail to plead his case. The league went further. They created the Gary Rule, requiring financial background checks for anyone borrowing money from the league's loan fund. Big Eddie got to announce it at the next tournament, to standing ovation. Local Facebook groups had a field day. Gary's mugshot became the profile picture for a group called Surviving Springfield's Worst, where people shared stories of his various scams over the years. The woman who ran the diner posted that he'd never tipped, always complained to get free food, and once tried to pay with a check from a closed account. The librarian shared that he'd stolen DVDs and tried to sell them at the pawn shop. Even his barber chimed in, saying Gary always tried to negotiate the price of a $15 haircut. The trial was almost anticlimactic after everything else. Gary's lawyer tried to argue for mental incompetence, which was ironic considering how he'd tried to have Mom declared incompetent. The prosecutor, a wonderful woman named Patricia, who wore pearls and had a voice like honey over broken glass, systematically destroyed every defense. She had receipts, literally and figuratively. The evidence was so overwhelming that the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, and that included lunch. 15 years. That's what Gary got. 15 years for fraud, attempted murder, assault, identity theft, and a handful of other charges that the judge rattled off like a grocery list. Gary tried to make a statement about being misunderstood, about how he'd only wanted to take care of his family, but the judge cut him off mid-sentence. "Mr. Peterson," she said, "the only thing you've taken care of is yourself, and you didn't even do that well." Mom got the house back free and clear, plus damages from the civil suit. The other victims got settlements too, though for some, the money couldn't undo the damage to their health and trust. We used part of the settlement to completely redo the house, starting with Gary's office, which we turned into a craft room where Mom now makes quilts for the women's shelter. Every quilt is a small act of reclaiming her space and her life. I started working with a domestic violence advocacy group, sharing my story and helping other families recognize the signs of financial and medical abuse. It's amazing how many people think domestic violence is just about physical hitting. Gary hit me once, yes, but the real violence was the slow, deliberate destruction of our lives, the calculated cruelty of his schemes. The slap in the hospital was just the visible part of an iceberg of abuse. The Gary Survivors Club still meets, now expanded to include 12 women who'd been targeted by him over the years. We have brunch once a month at this little place that serves bottomless mimosas and doesn't judge when Darlene gets a little loud after her third glass. We laugh now, really laugh, about things that seemed so scary at the time, like how Gary claimed to be allergic to gluten but would sneak bread when he thought no one was looking, or how he said he was a wine connoisseur but only bought the stuff from gas stations. Mrs. Chen from next door has basically adopted us. She brings over spring rolls every Sunday and sits with Mom, teaching her to play mahjong while gossiping about the neighborhood. Her daughter Amy helped us understand exactly what Gary had been doing with those supplements and testified at the trial. The other Mrs. Chen, my hospital roommate, sent a card saying she was proud of me for standing up to that bowling ball-headed fool. 6 months after the trial, I was walking into my new job at the Victim Advocacy Center when I ran into Rebecca, the nurse who'd slipped me that domestic violence card at the hospital. She remembered me immediately, said she'd followed the case in the news. "I knew you were a fighter," she said. "Sometimes you can just tell." We hugged right there in the parking lot, two strangers who weren't really strangers, connected by a moment of kindness when I needed it most.